everyone, and welcome to our brand new international episode of our podcast Millennials. This is the 6th episode of our international specials, and this time we will talk about neuroscience, the activity of brain and consciousness. We would like to welcome today here a very, very intelligent neuroscientist from Oxford, Marco Fabuš. Marco, hello.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. We are very happy that you are here with us today.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very happy to be here. So it took us a while to get it set up, but I'm glad that we are finally here, ready to talk about the brain.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But also I have to say that, Marco, this topic, the neuroscience topic, it's just such a mysterious topic for us because I personally don't know much about it. I don't think I know anything about it, in fact. And I would also like to welcome you. So, welcome, it's an honor to have you.
Thanks, yeah, and I have to say I agree. I mean, it's something that's in your head all the time, and yet we don't really stop and think about it too much.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Marco, please get ready, because it's possible that our questions will be all over the place, but it's only because this topic is so interesting for us, and we have so many questions that we will just ask them one by one as they come to our minds. Not that we have a scenario already right now, but but it's such a large topic for us. And also we are aware that we can't discuss everything today, and we don't want to be here for like 5 or 6 hours, so we are limited to 15 questions, so we think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, but also, we understand the brain. No, kidding, we don't understand the brain.
I will do my best so that in 15 questions, an hour's time, you understand the brain at least a bit better.
That sounds good, but I understand that we have a limited capacity of our brain, so if you don't know any answers to the questions, just yell next, and we're gonna skip it.
Yeah, so I hope the rules are clear, so let's go. This is the thing I wanted to say, that I'm currently watching Grey's Anatomy, Marco, so maybe I will take part in answering some of your questions if it's okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's very possible. My background's not actually in neuroscience, but it's in physics, so when it comes to like anatomy and stuff, you may well know more than I do.
Yeah, I'm professional right now. Thank you, Grey's Anatomy. Okay, so let's go. Marco, so you are a neuroscientist. That sounds like a study that is precisely taught at world-ranking universities. But we know that you come from a place, how would I say, not to offend anyone, a place, not even a village, in Slovakia, where there lived 10 or 15 people. So how is it possible that you got to Oxford, and what did you actually study?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not quite as bad as 10 or 15 people. I think it's about 60.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Definitely less than 100. So yeah, shout out to Tomky.
Shout out!
Yeah, that's right. So I grew up on a small farm in Slovakia near Malacky in this village called Tomky. Yeah, both of my parents, they were very supportive about my education, but neither of them speaks English. This was never really the plan to begin with. But basically what happened is that I was quite lucky that from an early age, I knew that English would be important in my life, and I was lucky to have additional lessons and stuff like that. So by the age of around 15, I actually spoke fairly good English. The accent was much thicker than it is now, but it was pretty good. And so we got this idea that it would be good for me to go to England for a year to improve my English, see something new, and hopefully learn more about the world around me. And it took me a while to convince my mother this was a good idea. She did not want to let me go, especially at 15. But in the end, I did, and so I came to London. I lived in South London in a place called Croydon, and it's basic, state school. And yeah, as I said, the idea was that I would be there for the year, improve my English. But it turns out that actually I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I was pretty good at it. So in England, you do this thing called A-levels. It's the equivalent of maturita, except it's only 2 years rather than 4 years. And so because of how my age worked out, I was born in July, they placed me in the year above, and I did pretty well in my exams. And so we were thinking that if I were to stay there, I can apply to British universities from there, rather than from Slovakia, and I would also gain a year. And so I stayed for another year. In my second year in England, I applied to universities. And again, so as I said, staying in England was originally not the plan, and going to Oxford was very much not the plan. So I was applying to 5 universities. Oxford was only one aspirational choice. The school I was at, no one had ever gone to Oxford. In fact, I remember that when I was quite young, I went to a friend's house, when I was maybe 12, 13. And they asked me, what do you want to do? And I kind of, at the time, I thought that this was realistic. So I was like, one day I'm going to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And they nearly laughed at me, but turns out in the end that happened. Anyways, so yeah, and so I applied to English universities from there, and I took an admissions test for Oxford, did the interview, and then I got an email that suddenly I was accepted. I was quite surprised because the interviews I didn't think went too well. But yeah, so basically a mixture of parents who kind of put a fair amount of value in education, plus I quite enjoyed kind of maths and physics and did a fair amount of that in my own time, plus the kind of, I was fortunate enough that I could do this year abroad, so that my English was pretty good. And all of that kind of came together, and here I am.
Yeah, plus a good brain.
Thanks. Yeah. Credit to my parents, obviously.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marco Fabuš, an inspiration for everyone. So you can do big things, even if you come from Slovakia, from a place that is not even defined as a village. But yeah, it's a good inspiration for everyone that you can do big things. You can go to Oxford. Okay, so let's start with introducing the brain, the mind, and also measuring it. So, Marco, we know that you probably eat these questions for breakfast. It's nothing new for you. It's something new for us. But could you please tell us just at the beginning, what is the difference between brain, intelligence, consciousness, and awareness? Because it's something that can be sometimes mixed up. And also, it's really late on Sunday evening. Normally, I use 10% of my brain capacity. Right now, it's probably 5%. So, like, if it can be really like something simple to absorb.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so let's get started. So the brain, quite simply, is the organ in your head that's kind of in control of the central nervous system. So if I were to cut you open, it's kind of a bit of a mushy, it's kind of like a mushroom, like, eggs, that kind of in your head. So that's the brain, or that's the organ inside of your head. So intelligence is normally seen as kind of the ability to kind of respond in novel ways, or kind of accurately respond. So if you're in a situation that you've never seen before, and you need to kind of process new information, how well can you do that? So that's normally how we think of intelligence. When it comes to awareness, and consciousness, that's a bit more of a loaded term, because you can kind of, philosophers define differently to neuroscientists, to psychologists, etc. But, normally we think of consciousness as kind of the simplest definition is that which is not there when you're asleep, okay? So, when you are in deep sleep, or if I were to knock you over, you're not conscious. And right now, presumably, you're kind of listening to these words and you are conscious. So whatever that difference is, that's what consciousness is. So kind of, again, this kind of capacity to be subjectively perceiving emotions, feelings, thoughts, that kind of thing. And awareness is very much related to it, but we normally just think of it as kind of, the kind of ability to focus on kind of one or two things and be aware of what's going on.
How does this fit with what Kaki already said? Because she said that usually we use only 10% of our brain, and I've also heard this before. And does this mean that 90% of the brain, or the potential of the 90% of the brain, is not explored, or we simply don't know how to use it, or it's used for like supportive functions, or what's up? Is this maybe the place where all the bad decisions come from?
Good point. So it turns out, this is a very common fact, the whole 10%, there was a whole film, Lucy, that was kind of built over that idea. Turns out it's mostly a myth, but it's a very old myth and a very pervasive myth, okay? So I kind of did a little bit of research, try to see where this comes from. And it's probably from around the 1890s. So, like 130 years old or thereabouts. Because early on, the kind of early psychologists, people like William James, they had this idea that if you took children and you raised them in special ways, you could get them to kind of realize their full potential, right? And in fact, there was this kind of one famous case study where they raised this kid. This father said that, I'm going to make my child into a famous mathematician, and the child did, in fact, become a famous mathematician. And so this idea came about that actually we haven't reached our full potential. And in the kind of 1920s or so, newspapers picked this up and they started saying stuff like, we only use 10% of our brain and things like that. So the reality is a little bit more complicated, because if you kind of think about it evolutionarily, right, the brain consumes a lot of energy. About a third of kind of all of the calories that we eat goes to our brain, even though it's quite small. And so kind of, it better be doing something really important, right? So if 90% of it was just sitting there doing nothing, then it's just a waste of energy. Kind of evolutionary, that wouldn't stand. So in fact, most of your brain is active most of the time. So the only ways in which the kind of 10%, 90% fact is true is that it's true that we have the potential, in theory, to remember a lot more, kind of speak more languages, or like I don't know, learn a lot more new things. So we call that plasticity in neuroscience. So your brain is very plastic. So not all the connections that could be there are there. So you have the potential to kind of, learn new things, which is really important. But at the same time, most of your brain is already engaged in some activity. So so it's true that maybe we kind of only form 10% or even less of all the possible connections. But that's because we have this kind of important ability to learn new things, and the brain's very plastic.
And do we use our brain 24/7? Like, does it never stop, or can we turn it off?
So it turns out it only completely turns off when you are dead. So it wouldn't be a good idea to try and turn it off. So even during deep sleep or anesthesia, which is what I study, it turns out the brain, again, there's lots of activity happening. So activity and information in the brain is stored electrically. So individual cells, neurons, they kind of sell electrical impulses to each other. And this happens even when you're asleep, even when you are in a coma and things like that. However, what changes is what that activity looks like, right? So for example, if you're awake and you're processing a lot of information, then, maybe all these different parts are talking to each other and there's lots of information in the system. Whereas if you're asleep, the brain is still active, but it may be kind of just doing something simple, like, for example, oscillating up and down in activity and things like that. But it's never really quiet, and it consumes about the same amount of energy when you're asleep as when you're awake.
So if I was asleep and I turned my brain off, I would be dead practically, because does the brain also play any function in like keeping my breath going?
Yeah. So when it comes to the breath and things like that, a lot of them aren't in the parts of your brain that you can control. So a lot of them are kind of in the older evolutionary parts of the brain. For example, the brainstem, which is kind of at the back of your brain. But absolutely, it kind of controls everything from breathing to wakefulness to heart rate and things like that.
Okay, we better take care of it. And
Exactly.
You've already said that our body or our brain consumes 1/3 of all the calories that we consume daily. I wanted to ask a little more about this, because I thought about this, or we heard about this before, about chess players. That those guys are able to burn up to 600 calories during one game, or sometimes perhaps even more. How is this possible? Like, so brain activity can literally be compared to like a strong physical activity?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So it's true that the brain consumes a lot of energy, and a lot of it is just kind of, for example, dissipated as heat, continues to kind of, there's lots of blood that you need to pump into the brain, and all of that happens kind of metabolically. But when it comes to the chess example, that's an interesting one. So it turns out, yes, chess absolutely burns some calories. The study that kind of, the claim that you're making came from originally is from 2009, and they found that chess masters were kind of spending about as much as you would spend whilst walking, slightly less. But so a kind of very hard chess match on a professional level may be equivalent to, say, like going for a walk. But it's important to mention that even then, the reason why I burn so much energy isn't that you kind of like using more of your brain or something like that. It's more to do with the fact that it's quite stressful, especially if you're a chess master and it's like a competition or something like that. So, your heart is beating faster, your blood pressure is higher, and it's thought that that's what kind of means that you're burning more calories. So it's not necessarily that the calories are burned to the brain. It's just that, some things that are kind of intellectually demanding are quite stressful, and that takes a toll on the body.
That's pretty cool.
We know that neuroscientists can measure brain activity, but how does it work? I imagine something like I will come to your office, you will tell me to lay down, you give me some chip on my forehead, or you will connect me to hundreds of electric sensors, or how does it work?
It's a great question. So it turns out there are so many ways to measure the brain, and it all differs in kind of what you're interested in. So as I said, the kind of brain or the ultimate level is made up of individual neurons, individual cells, kind of very small, kind of micrometer, less than a hair's breadth. But that's quite hard to measure. So, there's about 86 billion neurons in your head. So we can't measure every single one. And so, as I said, it depends on kind of what you're interested in. If you're interested in kind of very specific cells, so for example, I'm interested in, like, say, this very specific part at the front of my brain, what is that doing, right? Then the most common way to do that there is you have individual electrons. So you take like a piece of like an iron rod and you stick it into the brain. Normally this is done either in animals or in people whose brain you already have to open. So people have epilepsy or they're going to have operations and things like that. But that's one way. So that's the way kind of you measure the smallest level. But if you kind of zoom out, right, then you can measure a lot of neurons at once, the kind of average activity. And that's what I do. So actually what you described there, kind of, coming into my lab and having some electrodes attached to you, some electrical sensors, that's pretty close. So that's one common way to do it. It's called electroencephalography, or EEG. And basically, as I said, neurons communicate electrically. And so a lot of this electrical activity kind of makes it to the scalp, to the brain. And so if I put some electrodes on you, I can record that activity. That's not the only way. The other way that's really exciting and important for neuroscience is called magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. And there you would be put into this kind of tube. It's a kind of a fairly small tube, a bit of like a tunnel. And you're slid into this tunnel. And it's a tunnel because all around you there's a massive magnet, which is kept at around minus 270 degrees Celsius. And that way, we're not measuring the electrical activity, but we are measuring where water is in the brain. Because it turns out kind of magnetically we can measure where the water is. And this is useful because we can both tell something about the structure of the brain. So like, where are the neurons, how are they connected, but also about the function. So if I, for example, like show you some images, what is happening, because we can kind of tell where the blood is flowing in the brain, and that tells us something about which regions of the brain are more active at that time. So yeah, many ways to measure the brain. EEG and MRI are the most common ones.
What are the most common reasons why people want their brain get measured?
A lot of the times that you or the listeners may get their brains imaged is as a part of kind of some clinical investigation. So, for example, there are the sad cases of brain diseases, or kind of brain cancers, things like that. That's where you want to image a brain to kind of figure out which bits were damaged, which bits still work, things like that. So all these kinds of diseases, so things like epilepsy, it's very common to measure people's brain activity to kind of confirm that they have epilepsy. But kind of where I'm interested in measuring brain activity isn't just in brain disease, so that's a big part of it, but it's more just to learn about the brain itself. So we're hoping that by recording the brain in different situations, so we may give you a specific drug, or we may put you to sleep, or we may ask you to watch some images or listen to some audio, and measure the brain as you do that, and that tells us, hopefully, about which areas of the brain are responsible for, going to sleep or listening or viewing images and things like that.
So most of the time, if you measure the brain, it's because there is some problem?
Clinically, that's the case. It's a very important clinical tool. So yeah, it's either for research or clinical. Personally, I've had my own brain scanned kind of when we're piloting studies and things like that. I do just love looking at my brain. It's pretty cool to think that that's, in many ways, all I am is that wet lump. But you're right. Kind of in hospitals, mostly measured because the doctor suspects that there may be something wrong, and so orders a brain scan. That's fairly common. Or kind of in universities, we do all these kinds of research.
As you said, that there are some parts that can't be measured, right?
Yeah. So there are kind of two levels to that question. Is there something that we can't measure about the brain? There's the kind of practical question, and then the kind of bigger philosophical question. So practically, yes, it's true that we, at the moment, cannot measure every single neuron at all times, even though we would absolutely love to. As I said, there's about 86 billion of them. There's even more connections because each one can have multiple connections. So it's kind of a hopeless task to try and measure every single neuron. And that's why we kind of have to measure kind of, maybe with a resolution of about a centimeter. Depends on what technique you're using. But then there's the kind of bigger philosophical question of is there something about the brain which is not just electrical activity? And I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not going to be able to give you an answer on that, but I can just tell you what kind of people normally think and what I think. So some people say that matter is all there is, that, just like this what you can measure is all there is, and so by measuring the electricity, at least in theory, you could know everything about the system, kind of with some exceptions for quantum mechanics, etc., but basically everything is measurable. Then there's the other camp, which are people called dualists, who claim that there is such a thing called a soul. And this soul is kind of almost by definition immeasurable, kind of completely separate from the brain. And so they would say, yeah, there is something you can't measure, it's the soul. And personally, I'm actually kind of in between these two. I'm what's called a dual aspect theorist, which basically means that I say that everything has two aspects. So the matter and the mind are two sides of the same coin. So if I were to say, for example, I don't know, stick a pin in you, which hurts you, there is the pain, which is kind of more your subjective experience, but there is also the kind of brain state and electrical activity that I can measure. Every mental state corresponds to a physical state. So kind of personally, I think that in theory, almost everything is measurable. We may need better technology to actually do it. But as I said, not everyone would agree with my view.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
I hope that made sense. Also, I want to be very clear that, if at any point I'm not making sense, please, I'm very happy to kind of explain in different words, or, if That's the case.
No, I mean, it
Thanks.
makes sense. Like, you're explaining me this very clear. I'm just thinking about, like, what I think. So I'm just like, I'm going to think about this tonight, you know? Like,
Yes.
but I think I'm pretty, like, I think there is this soul thing. I think that, yeah, whatever. I am just going to think about it.
No, I was thinking the same. I was just listening to you, and in my head, I was just getting lost all the time. In a sense that this is such a big question for me, even to try to comprehend, that I need a self-complaint where I can be alone and myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I would say is that kind of like a lot of people think that if scientists say something like there is no soul, that, you know, the world is suddenly kind of like, you know, sad and dead and something like that. And that's absolutely not something that I think, because as I said, especially in the last couple of years, we're taking subjective experience more and more seriously. So, you know, like when you feel intense pain or happiness or love, all of that is very much real. We're just trying to understand kind of what physical states and what kind of patterns of electrical information correspond to it, so that we can better understand it, for example, when it goes wrong in some disease or something like that. So like, yeah, where I come from, like, you know, we don't deny the kind of importance of emotions and feelings and all that. They're just as real. It's just, I think, you know, they also happen in the brain.
If you say that the soul doesn't exist, I think it's quite sad, because, like, I think every religions, like, we believe that there is a soul and the body, and that if we die, you know, the body is going to stay here, but the soul is going to live somewhere in the heaven or with the devil, whatever you're going to choose. You know, so I think I will stay with the theory that there is a soul and there is a body.
That's fair. And to be fair, there are limits to kind of what science can say about that, right? You know, I could make different arguments and all that, but I'm not a philosopher, so, you know, I will not try to speak to that.
Oh, on the other hand, I was just gonna say, like, if tomorrow in the newspaper I read, like, there's no soul, I'll be like, okay, it still doesn't mean, like, world still feels pretty real to me. Like, it doesn't change a thing for me, so, yeah, fair enough.
Marco, we say that everything that we experience, that we go through our life, things we remember or we don't remember, perceptions, sensations, external factors, that everything is stored in our brain, and that we perceive things through some kind of receptors. And I don't know if you saw this quite a good movie, Pixar movie called Inside Out.
I have to say I haven't seen it, but you can tell me.
You need to see it, because I mean, this is the only thing like that helped me to understand how it's everything going in our brain. My question was if you watched the movie, but if you didn't, this is my recommendation to you. Like, go check it out, and you can tell me if it's really working like this. Like how we stock everything in my brain. That even if I don't remember, it's in my brain, and you know, stuff like this.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, most of what you said is very much correct. So, kind of everything that we perceive, everything that you experience, every emotion, every pain, all of that at some point is represented in the brain. So, in fact, we've kind of done experiments to confirm that in simple cases. That, for example, you know, like if you show specific lines or edges to the brain, there will be specific parts of the back of your brain called the occipital cortex, which light up. Similarly, in the motor cortex, which is kind of around the center of your head, kind of at the top bit, each body part has its own representation. So, like, if I were to, for example, like stimulate electrically one of those parts, you might feel something in your finger or in your leg or something like that. So, you know, the one of the roles of the brain is basically to have a model of the world. So kind of everything about the outside world ends up being represented somehow through the neurons and their activity. However, it's not quite true that the brain stores everything. You know, it's pretty amazing, but it doesn't quite have the capacity or the need to do that. So it's true that it's probably stores more than we consciously remember. And there are kind of many ways in which it might store the information, but you're not really aware of it. So, for example, like you may become afraid of something because of experiences, but you're not consciously aware that that's because of, I don't know, I saw a tarantula when I was 2 years old or something like that. So it's true that everything pretty much ends up being represented, and we may not always know kind of where that comes from. But when it comes to perceptions, again, absolutely. So, for example, I don't know if I touch something. There are receptors in my skin, which then send signals to my spinal cord in my back, which then gets sent to the center of the brain, to a bit called the thalamus, and then it gets kind of broadcasted to the rest of the brain, and I become aware of it. So, yeah, pretty much kind of, you know, everything you touch, everything you sense, feel, every word that you speak, all of that has some representation somewhere in the brain.
Can I decide what is going to be stored in my brain or not? Like, can I say, for example, like this, like, for example, something that really scares me, or something that I was really sad about? Can I say, like, I don't want this in my brain, like I want to forget it?
So, unfortunately, technologically, yeah, we're not at the point where we could remove it. I could probably like burn away a little part of your hippocampus, but probably I'd remove a lot more than just that one memory, so would not recommend it. But so there are some tricks that you can play on your brain. So for example, the brain is much more likely to remember novel information than kind of information it already understands. Because again, kind of evolutionarily, if you see a new predator or something like that, you better remember it.
Yeah.
And so kind of, yeah. And so you can use this a little bit to your advantage. Kind of, I don't know, like learning in kind of new scenarios or through new ways, or kind of talking about it rather than just reading everything. But unfortunately, there's not, you can't just kind of repress something and say, I'm going to forget this. There's a little bit where kind of, if you have things like, I don't know, trauma and things like that, there are therapeutic approaches that may help you work through it so that the brain doesn't consider it as important and then kind of slowly fades away. But yeah, it's not as simple as saying, that now be gone memory.
I wish.
Yeah.
I really like what you said, and I think this is the main takeaway for everybody, that it's not that the brain cannot remember everything. Maybe it just doesn't have the need to. So, if I forget about something, my brain didn't think I need this. Like,
it was a God's wish.
It's a good excuse. It was a God wish.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that the brain definitely has a way of deciding what's important and what's not.
No, it's just a good feeling that it's not that I'm not capable. I just don't need to. I wanted to get to another topic, which is psychedelics, and how these influence our brain and perception and, well, perhaps the biggest part of consciousness, or altered states of consciousness. Maybe I would like to divide these because we don't only have psychedelics, we have also psychoactive substances such as caffeine. But first I would like to start with LSD and mushrooms, where I believe the common denominator is psilocybin. Maybe you could tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very happy speaking about this, because actually what I mostly work on is anesthesia, consciousness, and a little bit on psychedelics. We do some work on ketamine. So so there's actually somewhere where I'm at home. So very happy to speak about that. So again, as I spoke earlier, the brain works on many different levels. And so when you ask a question like, how does LSD work? You could ask that question on the level of like an individual cell. What does it do to that? Or you could ask it on the kind of high level of groups of neurons. The analogy that I like to use is human society. So you could have the individual humans, which could be like individual cells, and then you have your like village, city, which is, a group of humans, and then on an even larger level, you have your countries and continents, which are kind of speaking to each other and trading and all of that. And so similarly, you can kind of have different levels of description. So when it comes to LSD and psilocybin, the kind of common denominator is a neurotransmitter, kind of chemical called serotonin. So both of them work on serotonin receptors. So each cell, each individual human in this analogy, has these receptors which decide whether it starts firing or not. And LSD and psilocybin can bind, kind of connect to these receptors and therefore change how it reacts. But turns out that's not actually a very useful description, because it doesn't really explain why, it gives you hallucinations or kind of new insights and all these kind of mystical experiences. So to understand that, we need to go on what's called the network level. So that's the level on the human society analogy. It would be kind of the level of a city or a country. And in neuroscience, that's kind of, millions of neurons, kind of the network level, what's happening on there. And what LSD and psilocybin basically do is they change which parts of the brain communicate together. So normally, kind of when you are, awake and kind of functioning normally during your waking life, there are parts that talk to each other, for example, the back of your brain with the front of your brain, and parts that don't tend to communicate that much. And if you take high doses of LSD or psilocybin, the brain in a way becomes more democratic. So parts of it that normally aren't connected are suddenly kind of exchanging information. And we think this is one of the mechanisms which can lead to hallucinations and things like synesthesia. So mixing of the senses. So, you can like hear colors and smell tastes and, things like that. So it's useful to kind of consider it from that kind of, network perspective and the brain becoming more democratic.
I think this is really bad because it makes me want to actually try the LSD.
Well, so I have to be clear that I can't endorse anything illegal.
Yes.
But I will say that there are people, some of them my friends, some of them my colleagues, who are working on studying psychedelics And one of the really exciting applications is using psychedelics as medicine. And specifically, they have shown very great promise to be helpful in things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, all these kind of very complex mental issues. And again, coming back to what I was talking about, the brain becoming more democratic, the idea is that basically it gives you a new perspective, right? You may be literally stuck in certain states, certain parts of the brain talking to different parts. And this kind of allows you to take a step back and gain new insight by kind of, literally getting a new perspective on your life, kind of, especially when talking to a therapist at the same time. So I mean, I can't say much about the recreational use. I'm not here to judge that or condone it, indeed. But I will say that there's some very exciting stuff coming out about their potential therapeutic use.
But this is not something new, right? Like this has already been studied in the 70s and 80s, but then the plug was pulled.
Absolutely, and there's quite an interesting kind of political history to why that happened, which is a completely different conversation. But yeah, I mean, these substances, LSD is kind of made in the lab not too long ago, but in general, the use of psychedelics goes way, way back, thousands of years. Kind of Native Americans, eating peyote cactus, and I don't know, the ancient Greeks getting high on ergot fungus and all that. So yeah, it's absolutely not new. What is new is us being able to study these using these novel brain imaging technologies, which then kind of tells us this is how it works and this is why it works.
Okay, so again, the outcome, when they took it, they were like, oh, this is cool. Now we're like, oh, let's study this. Let's see what this actually does to our bodies. Okay, and now, on the other hand, then, what about, like, maybe more common drugs that are even prescribed, such as sleeping pills or caffeine? What effect does that have on our minds or brains?
Yeah, so in some ways, a lot of those that you just described are actually fairly, easier to describe than psychedelics, because psychedelics do a hell of a lot of things, which is why it's kind of, sometimes it's quite profound, but also a confusing experience where a lot happens. But let's take something like caffeine. So caffeine also binds to a specific receptor. So again, on each individual cell, you have these kind of receptors which decide whether it fires or not. And this particular chemical is called adenosine. Doesn't matter, it's a specific receptor. But the interesting thing about it is that adenosine controls kind of tiredness and drowsiness in the brain. And so basically what happens is that if you block this receptor, then the original chemical, adenosine, can't bind to it. And therefore it keeps you more alert and more awake, but also causes other things that's possible, heart palpitations and things like that. So, and most of these drugs that we would class as stimulants, things like caffeine, Adderall, methamphetamine, things like that, they normally work in similar ways. So there is some specific chemical that causes you to be drowsy, and they block that chemical from affecting. So Adderall, for example, prevents a different chemical called norepinephrine, bit of a mouthful, and that one specifically allows you to have more dopamine, which kind of gives you more motivation and kind of more readiness for action and kind of more, you become a bit more jittery. So some of these drugs kind of target specific receptors, so it's kind of specific types of neurons. So sleeping pills, for example, again, different receptor, different chemical. This time it's called GABA and gamma aminobutyric acid, I think. Anyways, different chemical. And GABA is specifically important for controlling what's called inhibitory neurons. So neurons that act on other neurons to keep them quiet. And so if you enhance their activity, then more of the brain becomes quieter, there's less activity. And it, for example, becomes easier to fall asleep.
Are those, like the sleeping pills, caffeine, Adderall, is this something that in general you would recommend, like to consume it like in a big quantities, or is it something that can damage our brain or?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So sleeping pills are a little bit more dangerous than caffeine, especially depending on what type you have. So some of them can be quite addictive. So things like benzodiazepams, for example, they're only recommended to really be taken in extreme scenarios and only for a few days, because then you become addicted and the whole withdrawal process is pretty horrible. So, I mean, even with caffeine, if you drink it and then you can't drink it for whatever reason, you get pretty bad headaches and feels like you have the flu and things like that if you become addicted. So, I mean, personally, I have coffee on occasion, maybe like, a couple of times a week. I drink a fair amount of tea, I like green tea specifically, but all the research keeps pointing to the fact that what's more important isn't kind of saving ourselves with these individual chemicals, but just the basic stuff, keep a good diet, eat lots of green leafy vegetables, go for a run sometimes, be physically active, be around people that you like. And all of these things seem more important than, you taking some pills and hoping that they'll make the problem go away. So yeah, in the first instance, I mean, again, I'm not medically qualified in any profession, but just telling you about what I do. In the first instance, it's much more important to just sort out the basics about your habits and kind of what you do there. And there are some kind of medical conditions where that's not possible, and that's where, like you may take Adderall for ADHD, or you may have to take sleeping pills because insomnia. That's completely fine, that's not much you can do about. But for most of us, it's more important to get the basic habits right.
I have a question that is for me very personally interesting, and it's about Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory. I don't know if you've heard about this, but could you maybe try to... Have you heard about it?
I have indeed, yes.
Okay, so could you try to explain this theory to us as if you were sitting in a pub with your mates who have no idea about this theory and you're having a couple of pints?
Okay, yeah, let's try it. Okay, so there is this thing called psilocybin mushrooms. They're like these weird mushrooms that if you eat them, you see weird things and feel weird things, and yeah, the world becomes quite different. And the theory is basically that, well, these are mushrooms. They're kind of all over the place. You can just go into a forest sometimes, and again, not that I'm condoning this, but in many parts of Europe and the world, they just kind of grow around. And therefore, Terence McKenna kind of thought that maybe they had an important role to play in human history and human evolution. His specific idea was that kind of small doses of psilocybin may help with things like helping you see better and helping you bond with your group and things like that. And maybe this has helped us through evolution. So that's the kind of the pub spiel, and it's a pretty cool idea because, it would be pretty interesting if a substance like that was so important in our evolutionary history. Now, I have to say that at the moment, there's very little evidence for that because, for example, even though it may feel like you're seeing better on shrooms, actually, when you do the experiments, most of your kind of like cognitive abilities, like your ability to think and reason and like catch things quickly, all of that pretty much gets worse. Not better. But there is still place to be researching that theory, especially in not necessarily like a biological context, like this made us see better and therefore we evolved or whatever, but more in a kind of cultural or societal effect. So like it's thought that mushrooms can increase sociability and kindness between people and things like that. So it's possible that this would make kind of building a society easier, and it would make it easier to kind of get along with fellow humans. So maybe they've had a role like that. So, we definitely know that psychedelics, including shrooms, have been used for thousands of years. And yeah, it remains to be seen what their role exactly was. It may not be kind of biological, like Terence McKenna said, but it may have been quite important in kind of religious festivals and religious experiences and things like that.
Good. It was interesting. I didn't know about it. Thank you. Another very simple question. So in this rapid and information overloaded world, meditation and yoga should be good for our brain. Marco, what is happening in our brain when we meditate, and if meditating is good?
Absolutely. Again, a lot of this evidence is quite recent, last couple of years, last decade, but there is strong evidence for especially mindfulness meditation, so kind of just sitting down, paying attention to your breath, for being good in many ways. So for example, if you have already some sort of issue, like say depression, anxiety, chronic pain, then it's been shown quite helpful with alleviating those symptoms or kind of helping you treat that. But even in people that are completely healthy, it's seen that it improves your kind of general quality of life. People become happier, people become easier to deal with, become kinder towards others. And these changes are quite long lasting. And in fact, people have found that like your brain literally rewires itself when you become a regular meditator. So when it comes to what it actually does in the brain and why it's so good for us, well, the thing is that, okay, so more recently we've come to see brain activity in terms of what I would call states. So basically, as I said, you can think of this as kind of maybe tabs on your browser. So a specific state might be specific areas talking to each other for a few seconds, and that may have a specific role. So like, for example, one state may be tasked with, like, say, processing auditory information, sounds. Another state may work to process vision, images and things like that. And your brain is switching between these states kind of quite quickly. And what we've come to realize is that in some problems, like, for example, depression, they can be caused by basically problems between these state switching. So there's one state in particular which is called the default mode network, which is related to things like thinking about yourself, planning for the future. And there's another state called the central executive, which is about the outer world, so like paying attention to what's going around you. And if you have an imbalance between these two states, this can cause a mental illness. So for example, if you have depression, you kind of thinking about yourself, you feel bad about yourself, you're stuck kind of, in these kind of negative thought loops. And what meditation does is it helps you connect to the outer world, connect to the central executive state, the one that's basically paying attention to the outer world, and it can balance if you think too much or if you have negative thoughts and things like that.
Okay. You said that you were working also a lot with anesthesia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So actually what my group works on, most of my time is spent on analyzing data from anesthesia. So yeah, we measure the brain during anesthesia, and we're trying to explain what happens and how to make surgeries better, how to make patients' experiences better. And so, yeah, how does anesthesia work? That's kind of one of the main questions that I work on. And again, it comes back to one of these chemicals that I mentioned earlier, GABA. And so on a kind of individual cell level, these anesthetic bind to the GABA receptors and they cause more inhibition in the brain. There's kind of more quieting down influence. But it's also interesting to think about it on that network level that I mentioned, kind of different brain areas and whether they're talking to each other and not. And what basically happens is that the communication between them breaks down. So there's less information exchange between the brain areas, and all of the activity becomes much simpler. You basically get like periods of high and low activity every couple of seconds. So you go like up and down and up and down. And you can measure this, for example, using the electrical activity measurements, EEG, that I mentioned. That's actually what I study. It's called slow waves. And and so because the brain is much simpler, these different areas aren't talking to each other, all of it is just kind of oscillating up and down, we think that this is what makes you unconscious, that in order to be conscious, you need this kind of complex communication and all these connections, sometimes called also integration. You need the brain to be integrated together, and anesthesia disrupts that. And so you've got all these kind of individual brain areas just going up and down. It's not very interesting. And that makes you unconscious. There you go.
So is it like an artificial sleep?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So in many ways, it is similar to deep sleep. So kind of deep, dreamless NREM sleep. So, for example, in that deep sleep, we also see these slow waves. So just the brain kind of going up and down in activity. But in other ways, it is different. So for example, we think that sleep may have important functions for example, helping you consolidate your memory, kind of learn new facts, things like that. Whereas anesthesia doesn't seem to help with things like that. So we call it a sleep-like state. So it's similar to sleep in many ways, but there are also some differences.
Yeah, so people, when they get out, they need to sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
Again. Okay.
In fact, it's quite interesting. So I took one of the anesthetics for one of my experiments, and when I woke up from it, it wasn't as part of the experiment, not just kind of on my own. And and when I woke up, it's not like kind of waking up from a nice night of sleep. It actually felt quite like being drunk. Because, or kind of being hungover in a way, because a lot of these anesthetics don't just kind of put you to sleep, but they also act on a bunch of other things. And yeah, depending on what exact anesthetic you have, you'll feel slightly differently. But most of the time, it's not just like waking up from a nice sleep.
What should I be asking for when they're gonna put me on the table? Don't give me that.
So the one that's most sleep-like, it's called propofol. It's also called the milk of amnesia because it's this kind of white liquid that they inject into you, and it's the thing that killed Michael Jackson. Propofol.
I thought it was heroin.
Yeah. So it actually thought that what his doctor gave it was propofol in the end, and but that one is most sleep-like. The activity that we see in the brain is very much like the sleep, and from people that I've talked to that have had propofol, it can feel quite nice and refreshing. Other than like some of the other anesthetics. So if you get a choice, that's a pretty good one. Propofol is pretty safe. It's a little bit more expensive, which is why it's not used all the time. But that's my anesthetic of choice.
I'll remember.
Let's move to the last part. We are going to talk about brain disease and even death. So we are going to end with a good mood.
We're gonna get dark.
Gonna get dark. Okay, so Marco, we know that, for example, to get physically fit, actually, I don't know, like every time when I say physically fit, like this song is coming to my mind, like physically fit. Fantastic. Okay, so for example, to get physically fit, we know that we can do some exercises like, like for arms, for legs, for abs and stuff. Can we train our brain functions like with some kind of exercises?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the brain, just like any other organ, can learn. That's one of its main purposes. So yeah, I mean, there's a famous paper from my lab from a number of years ago that, for example, they taught people to juggle. So, just to kind of throw balls around, and they were able to show that this builds new structural connections. So like new neurons literally grow and the new paths grow and you can kind of find out which ones change. So yeah, absolutely. And, through kind of different exercises, you can improve your memory, you can learn new languages, learn new tasks. But the thing that's a little bit sad is that training only makes you good at the thing that you actually train. So if you, for example, train your memory, you'll be good at remembering things, but that says nothing about like how good you are at, say, how good your intelligence is and how good you are in new situations and things like that. So it turns out many of the functions of the brain are quite specific. So, if you train something specific, you'll be better at that, but it doesn't really carry over to other tasks.
So we can't be good in everything, right?
Unfortunately not. Yeah, there's just not enough time in a human life to be good at everything.
Either you have big biceps or big legs. Or you have good memory or good intelligence.
Yeah.
I actually tried to jungle this summer. It was
Me too.
really bad. Yeah, I was like, okay.
Oh yeah, I'm hopeless at it. Yeah, I can't do it either.
I squashed a pear on my floor.
And for example, Marco, like exercise like writing with both hands. Is it something? It's good like for our brain, or I'm just going to learn like to write with both hands? Like,
I mean, again, as I mentioned, unfortunately, training needs to be quite specific. So you'll become good at writing with both hands.
Nice.
That's a pretty good party trick, I guess. But yeah, it probably won't carry over to too many other things.
You can switch to chopsticks instead of cutlery.
yeah.
Yeah, or I guess, if you break your dominant arm, at least you'll be able to ride with the other one. Maybe that's useful.
Exactly. Okay, talking about the training, with Dennis, we were talking a lot about Alzheimer.
Yeah.
It's our favorite topic. We only talk about Alzheimer.
Every day. So we were talking about Alzheimer and dementia, and we think that especially for those diseases, like it's probably good to exercise, to connect the brain with the rest of the body, something like that. So is like our question was, if training our brain is a good prevention from this disease.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you bring that up because Alzheimer's is a huge problem, yeah, and it's only going to become more of a problem as we kind of have an older society with kind of more and more old people. So, yeah, okay, again, we don't really understand Alzheimer's completely, and to further mention, it's not my field, so I'm kind of recapitulating what my colleagues study, not what I do myself, but, so it's true that there are some things that have shown to be quite exciting at least slowing down Alzheimer's, if not completely preventing it. So we don't really know if it's completely possible to prevent it, but you can at least kind of like improve your chances and slow down the progress. So all of these can slow down, but may not completely prevent it. So first thing that helps is just, as I mentioned before, physical activity, right? So you don't necessarily just need to train your brain for this, just do some cardio, lift some weights, go for a run, do some squats.
Squats.
Yeah, and this helps because, exercise does so much in our brain. As you mentioned, it builds the connection between the mind and the muscle, but it's not just that, it improves, you make it easier to kind of produce the happy chemicals, so it normally improves your quality of life, and it strengthens your cardiovascular system, it improves your immunity. So in general, it's a really good idea to exercise at least a couple of times a week, so please do. And that also translates to slowing down Alzheimer's. And when it comes to more specific brain exercises, again, yes, it's true that you can kind of help with specific aspects. So for example, Alzheimer's makes your memory worse. So if you train your memory by, say, like exercises where you have to remember numbers and things like that, you will get better and your memory will stay for longer. Equally, there's a thing called speed of processing. So how quickly can you process information? So there's an exercise where you can do where you just very briefly flash an image and you have to remember it. And again, if you give this to Alzheimer's patients, they can train this and they become better at speed of processing and they don't kind of go down as quickly. But especially if you're young, I wouldn't spend too much time on it, just like on your phone trying to remember numbers or whatever. It's more important as I said, be physically active if you can and try and do something that kind of keeps your brain engaged. It doesn't have to be that, maybe your work does that. Like maybe you have to, do some Excel spreadsheets or whatever, and you can do that in new ways, and that can keep you interested, and keeps your brain active. But yeah, so it's quite exciting that for people who already have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, all these exercises may slow it down, but we don't really know if it completely prevents it. And yeah, in general, be nice to yourself, but also do some squats.
Okay.
Squats.
I'm gonna be nice to myself while doing squats. You're doing good. You already started this, and I want to get a little dramatic because we pay a big price for longer lives. It rhymes too. No, it's really intense, but it's true, because researchers alarm that the higher cases of dementia are directly correlated to the longer expectancy of life. Is this true? And maybe should I start drinking and smoking just to prevent dementia?
Yeah, so again, unfortunately, it is true. We are seeing more dementia. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. So yeah, absolutely, it's a problem, and it's not just brain diseases; it's cardiovascular issues, strokes and things like that. And yeah, it is a big problem, and especially here in a country like the UK, where like people have better lives and therefore they live longer. But it's already catching up in countries like Slovakia, and it's even worse in other countries like Japan, for example. And yeah, it's a big problem, and that's why a lot of money is going into it. We have a big centre, for example, for studying Alzheimer's here in Oxford. But it's not something that we fixed yet. And prevention seems to be a lot more important than actually curing it, because curing it seems really hard. We don't really know how to do it yet. So if you can, absolutely, it's a good idea to, stop smoking, do more exercise, eat more vegetables. And I know that can be hard, not everyone can do that. But maybe, I don't know, eat less red meat. That's a more noble thing. But yeah, absolutely. And the thing to realize is that it's not just kind of doing it to kind of prevent dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. It's also to just improve your life whilst you are there, right? Your life will be better if you exercise and eat vegetables and sleep enough and all of that. If you're not as stressed, and if you manage to hang out with people that you like, and if you have a job that you like and all of that, your life has a high quality, not just when you're 70 and you don't have dementia, but even in between, right? You can actually enjoy yourself. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend that.
Okay. Oh, that's pretty cool. The goal is not to live longer, but to enjoy it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Because we don't even know. Because it's true that we may not be built to kind of live that long. The average age is still rising in many countries, but the maximum age doesn't seem to rise too much. It's very hard to find anyone with confirmed age beyond like 110 or 115. And so, yeah, it may be the case that in our current physical bodies, that are just a bit too mushy to last much longer than 100 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't make the time that you have as good as possible.
Okay, we talked about the exercise. What about the food? Is some food good for our brain? Like, for example, they're always telling us to eat nuts for our brain, to eat carrots for our eyes. So is nuts the good food for our brain?
Yeah. So this one actually is not a myth. A good diet. A good diet is really important for your brain, because it needs all of these different chemicals that I mentioned. Like, all of them need different building blocks that you need to make them in order to work well. The most important things are omega-3. So that can be found in some nuts, like in chia seeds, for example, walnuts, but also in fish, in salmon especially. Fish is pretty good for the brain. But even in things like, kiwi fruits. So omega-3 has been shown to, for example, slow down Alzheimer's again. So quite important. So that one's really important. B12 vitamin, really important. It's been shown to improve memory performance, especially in women. Again, you can find it in fish. You can find it in milk. If you don't eat animal products, you can either get it in tablets, or you can kind of eat some seaweed or yeast-based products, things like that. And then, as always, it's important to just get your basic vitamins and minerals, like, vitamin D and E and calcium, selenium, all these kind of fancy things. And that can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming. Like, how do I get all of these things that my brain needs, right? And I kind of struggled with it a little bit when I first tried to think about nutrition. But it turns out that, nature made it fairly easy. The things that you normally recognize as good for you, right? So, like, say, a little bit of lean meat, maybe. Lots of, nuts, seeds, vegetables, especially green leafy, so spinach, broccoli. All of these things, they already have the things that you need, right? So if you just kind of, cut out, especially the kind of high sugar stuff, processed meats, things like that, that tends to have an effect. But it's not like an immediate effect. It's not like I have a kiwi and suddenly I'm a genius. It's these small changes that you make. I know, it's a shame. Kiwi is my favorite fruit, but
I was gonna stock up.
But it's these small changes that kind of over years do make a difference.
So persistence is again the key.
Absolutely.
One last question before our last question. Okay, no, but one last question that touches upon this topic. Is it true that we see our whole life before we die? Like the film?
Yeah, that's a big question. So it turns out it's possible. We still don't really know if this is something that happens automatically. Probably not. But it's true that
I thought it was a myth.
So here's the thing. Okay, so you probably don't see all of your life as everything happened. That's probably not true. But it is true that when you starve the brain of glucose, sugar, and oxygen, kind of different bits start being damaged, and this can actually cause a very kind of confusing set of hallucinations. So we know that, for example, if you stimulate certain parts of the brain or you remove them, then that can cause memory replay. So what the experience is probably like, again, luckily I've never died or had a near-death experience. I'm still here. But, so it's probably quite chaotic. So maybe like a dream, like the scenes keep changing and things like that. But it's possible that kind of parts of your life could be replayed. It's probably quite confusing, more like a hallucination. Probably doesn't last that long. But yeah, so we're not really sure what happens. But I wouldn't be surprised if the brain, as it's kind of very, in a crazy mode, trying not to die, it would kind of, try everything.
That's so sad.
But you said something interesting. I think you said that you could replay, or you could replay. Yes, basically you could replay memories if you manipulated the brain in some way. That makes me think: is it possible that we live in Matrix?
So that's a big question.
Average is seeing what we've already lived.
Yeah. So I'm gonna again, it's more of a philosophical question. I'm gonna make a bit of a cop-out answer. I don't know, but personally, I don't think it matters as much. Because here's the thing, regardless of like whether what I'm experiencing is kind of, the signals on some like supercomputer somewhere, or the signals in some like mushy, brain full of electricity, either way, the experience feels just as real. I can still enjoy a nice meal and laugh with friends and all of that. And I would think I would enjoy that even if I wasn't the Matrix. But it's true that through simulation, you can make people do all sorts of weird things and make them feel all sorts of weird experiences.
That sounds cool. Let's do it. Anyways, thank you very much. The very last question we ask every single of our guests, and it would be perhaps something that you would like to recommend. I would maybe like to ask you for a recommendation for people who don't know much about their brains and they would like to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So it depends on kind of whether your readers are looking for like books or podcasts.
It can be something to watch, to listen to, or even read.
Yeah. So I mean, there's plenty of really good books to kind of start on this. There's one which is really good, which is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And so that's a pretty good book. It kind of, tells you all about, how the brain can act very weirdly and differently if you damage different parts and things like that. So that's a pretty good book. When it comes to podcasts, there's a friend of mine, a colleague from Oxford, who's part of the Pravidelná dávka podcast.
Oh.
So they talk about philosophy, about science, and so if you want to learn a little bit more about kind of biology or bioengineering, that's a pretty good place to start. And yeah, that's a pretty decent way to start it. And honestly, the other thing that I would just mention is just put things into YouTube. If you want to know kind of how does the brain work, how do hallucinations work, all of that. Quite often, if you just put your question into YouTube, especially in English, you'll find pretty good videos on like TED Talks. I really like this one. A colleague of mine, Anil Seth, is a consciousness scientist. So here's some pretty good TED Talks you can find either on YouTube or on the TED website. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend you check those out.
Oh, that's a great recommendation. I think anybody's capable of opening YouTube and typing down, how does memory work? What do I do when I want to remember things? Yeah, that's good. Marco, thank you very much. It was really, really, really interesting. I have so many questions that I would still like to ask you. But I can tell that my brain is now cooked.
No, thank you. I mean, I have to say that time flew by really quickly.
Really, like this hour went flying. But I would like to thank you again. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. If you didn't enjoy it, you can also let us know at millennials.podcasty@gmail.com, or you can contact us through social media. And in case you have some suggestions for the next guest or some other questions, you can shoot us a message. We really hope... Sorry. Počkej, začnem ešte raz toto. Nech to tam potom vystrihneme. Takže to bude strih. We really like... No, ešte raz. Ešte, že robíme podcast. Dúfam, že som tak rád, že toto není na live.
Asi tak.
We really hope you like this episode, because we're planning on bringing you the second part where we would try to answer all the questions that we still have. This podcast is made in cooperation with Theatre Falangir, and we would like to say hello to our fellow friends. So, hey guys, well, Kaki, that was another one. should we go recover our brains now?
You said, should we just fuck off?
Yes, should we just fuck off? Oof.
Yeah. My brain probably needs a rest. Yeah, but it was really good. Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. I look forward to hopefully doing this again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will. Don't worry.